Yeah. We'll start the presentation soon. Hi everyone, that was just for the IT guys at the back there. But yes. Sasha.
Just waiting. Can they put the first slide one? Then I'll. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate your attendance here. And so here we're going to talk about the GEO LDN Initiative, Land Degradation Neutrality, which was established last year in Kyoto. This is an initiative that comes from the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, which is the custodian agency for 15.3.1. My name is Sasha Alexander. I'm a policy officer at the UNCCD, and I'd like to introduce my two colleagues, or I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves, and we'll take you through this show. Alex.
Thanks, Sasha. My name is Alex Wallach. I'm from Conservation International and the Moore Center for Science, which is the science division at Conservation International. We're a major environmental nonprofit, and I'm the co-lead of the data analytics working group for the GEO LDN Initiative, which we'll be hearing a lot more about in a minute. So thanks for coming. Look forward.
G'day, I'm Neil Sims and I'm at CSIRO. I co-chair the GEO LDN Initiative and also help with the data analytics part of it. And my team and I wrote the Good Practice Guidance document, which is hopefully helpful to countries as they're trying to calculate land degradation in their countries.
So great. I think if I click on this next slide, we'll have just a 1.5 minute video to tell you what, just to put the context of what we're doing. This is something we produced back in 2015 when the SDGs were launched. Yeah, I think it's the next slide. But this is target 15.3. So this is the target that the indicator is linked to. And we'll talk more about that.
Land is the foundation of our societies. It is the engine of economic growth. We build our homes on land, we transport goods by rail and road across the land, we grow our food and produce our energy on the land. Land filters our water and brings it to our taps. Why then do we take land for granted? Why do we degrade this life-giving asset? Why do we misuse it and treat land like dirt? Every year we're losing 24 billion tons of fertile soil, 13 million hectares of forest. Sprawling cities and slums are covering some of our most fertile and productive land. Fortunately, we can wake up to a land degradation neutral world. We can create the future we want in two simple ways. We can protect what we have left and fix much of what we have destroyed. Where landscapes are underperforming, we can make them more productive. Where they're sick and tired, we can restore them to health. We have the knowledge, we have the experience. We can roll out affordable and effective practices to manage the land and its resources better. This is the way to reach the other goals on food and water security. It is how we will end poverty and deliver real climate action. Isn't it obvious that we need to take better care of our working landscapes? Let us invest and protect the land, the foundation of all life, to achieve sustainable development for all.
Yeah. So as you can see, we think land is fairly central. The condition, the status, the productivity, the health of our land resources. So we're talking about soil, water, and biodiversity. I'm going to take you a little bit of background on LDN, land degradation, the indicator itself. So the SDG indicator is proportion of land that's degraded over total land area. So this is part of the SDG indicator framework. It's composed of 3 sub-indicators. So we're using the trends in land cover, trends in land productivity, and the soil organic carbon stocks. So these are mandatory indicators within the UNCCD process. So we've been very fortunate, and we've been able to align the UNCCD reporting, the monitoring and evaluation approach that we've taken with our parties. So we're talking about 196 countries and the European Union as our parties to look at the indicator and estimate the proportion of land that's degraded. So as I mentioned, the SDG indicator is being run by the Statistical Commission, and there's an interagency expert group that is in charge overseeing the entire indicator framework. There are approximately 240 indicators in the framework, and they're all attached to the different targets within the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Our indicator was, last month, was just upgraded to Tier 1 status, and that basically means that there's established methodology, international standards exist, and there's a threshold by which the reporting has reached globally and regionally. So we're very happy that this happened. And this is basically due to our latest cycle of reporting within the UNCCD. It was in 2018. We had 123 countries report on the sub-indicators as well as the SDG indicator. So there was a country validation process. So it's very important in terms of the SDGs that the countries feel they have ownership over that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, how we try to ensure that through every step of the process, the country engagement and ownership. We also did estimates for 42 countries. And we also did a validation exercise with those countries as well. Those are recorded as estimates. So within the SDG database, there's quite a differentiation between the estimates and those that have been country generated. So going in terms of the UNCCD, our main focus is on capacity building for our countries, helping our countries implement the mandate of the convention, which centers around sustainable land management, ecosystem restoration, and poverty alleviation. So within the sustainable development paradigm, looking at all the various land issues. We established a target setting program back in 2014, actually, in anticipation of the SDG target 15.3. And now we have 122 countries that have gone through various different types of assessment exercises, identifying hotspots, looking at the indicators in a very detailed subnational way in order to establish different measures and interventions that they can take.
Sasha, can I just...
Yeah, so if there's any questions, yeah.
We want to run this a little, we try not to, this is why we're standing up, we try not to run it like we're going to tell you what's happening and then you'll take it all away. If you have any questions, ask them as we're going along. We don't want to be here forever though, so probably what we'll do is take one question per slide, so get in quick. I also wanted to mention, has anyone, is this the first time in Australia for many of you? Can you raise your hand, please? Okay, cool. So this is a great map here covering a lot of the globe. Does anyone notice any glaring omissions there? This is a chance for you to get brownie points. Yes, good man. I don't even need the answer, but I'm glad you raised your hand. Thank you so much. So, this is a great initiative globally, and yet some of these countries that are deeply involved in the science of land degradation and also, some of the primary degraders, if you like, we need to work out a way to better engage with some of those countries. You're in one of them now. a country that shall remain nameless. So sorry, Sasha, thank you.
No, that's a good point. I would just clarify that although they're not in this program here, Europe tends to, we had about half of both Western and Eastern Europe reporting in their national reports. And some of those actually did provide the data that was required. So it's not the whole picture in terms of the monitoring and reporting. The initiative is something that our governing body, which is called the Conference of the Parties, meets every 2 years. They invited GEO back in 2017 to establish some type of a mechanism by which they could support the implementation of the convention and specifically in terms of using Earth observation to help our countries in a policy relevant way, something that could be actionable on the ground. So it's considered a fairly unique stakeholder. I think there's a couple other UN initiatives or UN-driven processes within the GEO community, but this one was made quite explicit. And then we just had our last conference of the parties in Delhi in September, and there was a great deal of recognition of the work that the GEO community has done in terms of capacity building, in terms of improving some of the methodologies and the provision of data sets and making them accessible to our countries. Here's some of the the publication produced by JAXA at the bottom there was very helpful. Of course, there's many different partners, just to mention the European Space Agency, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, the World Soils Information Center based in the Netherlands, to name a few, of course, Conservation International, CSIRO, CEOs, something that we've begin to establish a good collaboration with, and particularly for some of the working groups that we have that you'll see is going to be instrumental. As I mentioned, the request from the parties, which is a formal decision of the parties. We have, and out of that decision came the 3 working groups that compose the initiative. So working group 1 is building capacities, both at the national level and the subnational level. We have not only national stakeholders that participate in this process, but we have local stakeholders, project managers, large landowners, local administrations. So if these stakeholders bring their shapefile, then we can really do a lot with the 3 sub-indicators in showing them what's going on.
I was just going to mention probably Joost Tuben, wave please, is co-chair of Working Group 1 there, and he's very keen to talk to you all. Is that correct, Joost?
Yeah. So
yeah,
we're gonna reach out to you, and then we're gonna do this interactively in a little while. We have a little time, and we want to hear your ideas on capacity building. What have been your experiences? What are the lessons that you've learned in other initiatives, in other ways, in other processes that you've been involved with? So please think about that. Working Group 2, data quality standards, putting together decision trees for our stakeholders, because there's a whole plethora of data sets that are out there. How do countries or stakeholders decide which data set is most appropriate for me given my national context? Small island developing states, countries with a large proportion of mountainous regions. These are all really important questions when you're looking at the EO data sets. This is, we're going to talk a little bit more about this one, but we're fairly well advanced, and we really appreciate the generous support of the German government in this case. And this will go into the good practice guidance. We produced a version 1.0. Cyril, Neil was the project lead on this. It was fantastic. It informed a lot of our tools, a lot of our manuals, glossaries, and so forth. So we're in the process of looking at a revision of that for our next reporting cycle in 2021. Then working group 3, these guys will talk a lot about that, but basically the data analytics and what we can do in terms of collaborative platforms. This is just, you don't have to focus too hard on this, but this just shows you how we as a UN multilateral agreement are focused on this process. And it's every 4 years we've aligned the SDG reporting with the UN CCD reporting. So the SDG reporting follows in the next year. But this is just a brief snapshot of some of the things that we need to go through in terms of providing support to our countries. Working group 2, there are many data sets and approaches, and so here the issue of data quality, what's the most relevant, what's the most accurate in terms of my national circumstances. So we felt that this was a gap within the good practice guidance 1.0, and it's something that the GEO LDN initiative is really helping us address. And the work that's being done on analysis-ready data, particularly the CEO's work on CARD4L, is super. But we also want to take a look at it from the data user perspective as well. What do they need, and how can we better tailor some of the tools and the functionality when we're particularly providing non-technical people with these data sets. A little bit more in terms of the depth of the mandate or the terms of reference for Working Group 2. This is very much related to the updating of the GPG and the creation of these decision trees, which we also felt will be very helpful. And again, we want to hear from you and seek your advice on what are some of the other things because I know there's a lot of good practice guidance out there for a lot of different indicators, a lot of different Earth observations. So just want to hear a little bit of your experiences on that, because we're still at the stage where we're open to determining that. Working Group 3, I think here I'm going to just turn it over to Alex, and we'll hear more about that.
Thank you, Sasha. And as is probably evident from, of course, the title of the session around actionable information, Working Group 3, which is really focused on analytics to support both reporting to the UNCCD and then also implementation of projects around LDN, is really, of course, very key here. And so the work that we're doing in terms of Working Group 3 is centered, again, around both provision of tools around reporting, but then also around addressing the question of if you're actually implementing projects on the ground, there may be additional information beyond the 3 SDG indicators that you will likely need both for planning and monitoring your projects. So in terms of the focus for Working Group 3, I've already covered on the left-hand side. One thing I want to highlight here, though, is there's, of course, key connections with other ongoing GEO initiatives as well as other projects. CARD4L, as Sasha mentioned, of course, is a key one. There's also the CEOS LDN group, which I know Neil is closely connected to, is a key piece here, as well as, of course, work done by the Joint Research Commission, by ESA. So part of the goal of Working Group 3 is to coordinate among the actors in this space so that we can really build something that's more than the sum of the individual tools that are already existing in this area. But a key goal of Working Group 3 is to ensure that the tools that are provided through the working group are free and open. So of course this means also leveraging things like work on data cubes and other projects supported by GEO because a key outlet for these tools are many times countries that may lack financial resources or capacity to access some existing commercial options. We do want to ensure that we support tools that are free and open source. And then the other thing I want to highlight is, of course, the whole idea of the LDN initiative is to have a coherent body in support of LDN. So the work of Working Group 3 is very much connected, of course, to the work of Working Group 2 around standards and decision trees to support decision-making in LDN, and then, of course, around capacity building as well. So these three really need to be integrated very seamlessly to ensure that the initiative is successful. So what I have here is, so this is something we're still discussing within the working group in terms of how we can draw on those existing pieces of software, technologies, data sets that are existing already in the community to build them into a coherent decision-making support platform around LDN. So basically the idea is to build on existing tools. I've already mentioned some. Also cloud technologies, for example, Google Earth Engine is of course one, Sentinel Hub and others as well. But to support for end users who many times may have a low level of technical capacity with handling Earth observation, to really provide tools that are broadly accessible so that we can democratize access to information around implementation of LDN. Another key point I want to point out here is also because, of course, we're focusing both on supporting implementation and design of projects around LDN as well as national reporting. One goal of the working group is also to make reporting to UNCCD, the PRICE portal is the tool that's used for that, to make reporting as seamless as possible for countries. So I want to show one quick example. You may have heard of Trends.Earth. So this is an existing platform in this space that's been used with countries. This development of this tool was led by Conservation International, where I'm based, in collaboration with Lund University and NASA, with the support of the Global Environment Facility. And we're fortunate enough to have a very close partnership with UNCCD as well as with CSIRO during the development of the good practice guidance that you heard about earlier. So the idea of Trends.Earth was to build a tool to support countries in analysis of data, both for reporting as well as implementation of projects around LDN. That's consistent both with reporting needs as defined for the SDG and the UNCCD, but then also with the emerging data quality standards that were developed by CSIRO. So the tool has seen very wide take-up within countries thus far. We were able to access around over 140 countries in trainings last year, over 2,300 users using the platform online. And the idea here was to leverage both cloud computing as well as, in some cases, local computation facilities to address both concerns of needing access to computation as well as trying to ensure data security. So what does this actually look like? So what you see here is a map of productivity. This is one of the global data sets that can be used for one of those three indicators of LDN you saw earlier. What you can do, whoops, can't see if I turn off the screen. There we go. What you can do with the Trends.Earth tool is zoom in into a particular area. So for example, here, looking of course at Kenya, and you can use the Trends.Earth tool, which is free and open source, built in QGIS, free and open source GIS platform, to zoom into that country, access data sets, pull them in from online, and then analyze the three LDN indicators. So here, of course, we're looking at productivity, soil organic carbon, which is drawing on globally available data sets produced by ISRIC and others, and then land cover, drawing again on information from global data sets here produced by the European Space Agency. And what the tool allows users to do at the end of the day is integrate these three sets of information into a single layer. And a key need that was identified by users is also being able to incorporate not only global data sets, but also locally available information. So there is the facility to do that within this tool, which is of course something we recognize within the LDN initiative as well, is providing tools that are flexible and analytics that are flexible to integrate local information on context as needed. At the end of the day, of course, it also supports reporting. This is an example of a report table output by the tool. You probably can't read it, but there's a tab on there at the bottom that says UNCCD reporting. This is not a UNCCD tool, but it's to support the UNCCD process. So the data is actually output there in the format that's needed for reporting. So that's just one example of a tool in this space. But of course, there's certainly a huge need to go beyond the monitoring perspective and setting of baselines, which was a big focus thus far as we developed the SDG. towards more provision of actionable information for actual decision making to achieve LDN.
Can I just add a comment here? The development of trends.earth and the development of the good practice guidance documents happened concurrently. That was happening at the same time. And it was a really fantastic way to develop these kind of tools. We've seen the significant effectiveness of trends.earth in terms of making this kind of data analytics available to all kinds of countries all over the world. The process of developing them at the same time was really great. Often I'd be trying to write something about how maybe we should be interpreting productivity, and I'd send it to Alex and his colleagues, and they'd come back and say, man, I cannot understand what you were saying here. And I'd go, yes, I don't understand it either. So we'd be able to revise things sort of on the fly. It helped the implementation of the methods, and it helped the development of the methods themselves. I've also had a bit to do with data cubes and things like this recently as well. And I would say, even though this doesn't work on a data cube per se at the moment, anytime someone asks me for an example of an app designed to support end users that draws on an extensive time series of data, like a data cube, I point them to this one. I think it's the best example globally of an app that fits onto a data set like that. So it's a really great bit of kit. And we should be developing these kind of tools for other SDGs, and Alex is working on this as well, but also for many other applications. It was a fantastic example of the way to build it and the outcome too. So have a look at it if you can.
Yeah, definitely, thanks, Neil, and certainly to echo that, I think this collaboration is really key, both with data producers, tool producers, in order to ensure that everything actually works well for end users. So now what we're really thinking about is, and I'm not saying that we've put that monitoring issue to bed. Of course, there's further work that we can do to improve the resolution, other issues around monitoring for SDG 15.3. But a big focus of the initiative now is also how we can integrate further information to support land use planning. And this is something that I think came out clearly at the COP in Delhi when there was a request from parties that there be further support and development of these types of tools. And so the idea is really to go from this more sort of baseline monitoring type of tool towards something that can actually support integrated land use planning, where you can actually go through to consider alternative development scenarios, understand how those might result in different types of land use change, impacts on things like soil, water, and biodiversity. And then, of course, all the way through the end, trying to look at things like human security and human well-being, and understanding how these changes in the land can really have very direct impacts on the human side as well. And of course, a key part of this also is understanding not just land condition, but also land potential. And what you see here is a report by the IRP, the International Resource Panel of UNEP. I think was this led by Jeff, right? Led by Jeff Herrick, who's a key member of the IRP panel there. But the idea is really to look at how you can understand long-term changes and the potential of the land to support things like ecosystem services. And this is key within the LDN framework, is understanding that if we're to achieve land degradation neutrality, we actually need to understand what types of changes are occurring within types of land units of similar land potential. So we need to understand, are we losing land of high potential? That, of course, can't be replaced by restoration of land of low potential, to really trying to get a better idea of how we can bring in other data sets to assess land potential in addition to land condition. And of course, there's existing tools in the community that we're interested in drawing on as we move into this more land use planning type approach. One, of course, is the CLUE model, now maintained by Peter Verberg. But the CLUE model is an example of a free land use modeling framework. There's different variations of this tool I'm sure folks are familiar with. There's the CLUE-S model, for example, which is designed for more regional to landscape scale changes. But what we're looking at doing within the data analytics working group is linking with these existing tools so we can better support provision of information to policymakers. Of course, other examples as well. One is this example developed by CSIRO in Australia, the land use trade-offs model, which lets you look at, on an annual timescale, changes in land use while bringing in things like global pricing, looking at alternative types of land use, whether you're focusing more towards bioenergy agriculture, et cetera. So another example of a trade-off model that we could draw on as well in this process. And so at this point, I'm going to hand over to Neil Sims, who's going to discuss further around tools.
Thank you. So I'll admit that this isn't my work, and as pretty typical with CSIRO, we have to travel all over the world to international meetings to find out what's happening inside CSIRO, because it's a fairly big place. So, and I have heard about this before, but haven't had much to do with it. So, what I thought I'd do now is talk about, this session is about actionable data, and when I was thinking about what to say, I thought, well, what does that mean? I think it probably means and for this community, what kind of data sets are we looking for? What kinds of support are we looking for from the community here to really improve the outcomes for land degradation globally? I just thought I'd show a couple of examples really from Australia, which are hopefully interesting to you. You will have noticed, as I pointed out earlier, there's a couple of gaps on that map about countries that are engaging with LDN. And some of those countries that are not engaging particularly deeply with LDN are winning at land degradation globally, if you know what I mean. And so here's an example of a country that's doing pretty well on land degradation. So what this is this shows us one interpretation of the productivity condition using NDVI, which I won't explain, but I presume you're all familiar with. It's a nice, compact way to represent plant happiness, essentially. So this includes all of the effects of rainfall and seasonal impacts and things like that. It essentially compares peak plant happiness across years. This is an interpretation of plant happiness that takes into account, that calibrates out the effect of changes in rainfall, essentially. It's not quite rainfall, it's water use efficiency, which looks at how much evapotranspiration is happening in the forests, and it calibrates out sort of greenness, annual net primary productivity, as compared to how much water was available for the plants. And you can see when we do that, when we calibrate out those impacts, we're seeing, a much larger projected area of potential degradation. So that means essentially, I think one way to interpret this is that occasionally we're getting the right kind of rainfall, but over the longer period of time, the productivity is declining, even in those areas that are getting some of the rainfall. Here's the Tasmania. Many of you will know this area. This is another interpretation of the same thing. Essentially, when we calibrate out the rainfall, it gives us sort of a poorer picture of plant condition. This is the indicator. So that was just for productivity, and this is the indicator that Alex mentioned that combines the soil organic carbon, the productivity, and land cover change. And so we calibrate out this with the water use efficiency method here again, and it gives us a bit of a poorer picture. So just an example there from Australia about some of the outputs that we're getting out of trends.earth. Now I think one way to interpret this kind of thing is that when we account for climate variations, it should theoretically represent more kind of our impact, human impact, if you like, on the vegetation condition. So I like to interpret this kind of a product as more closely representing the kinds of impacts of interventions that we're having on the land. And so one of the key things that we're trying to do here, of course, is we're trying to untangle all of the different land uses and the different ambitions for land use, looking at them with climate and without climate effects. We want to be able to help countries make the best decisions about how to use their land. And this kind of information is one kind of information that we find quite useful. Now so this is some of their actionable data needs, and I'll talk to you a little bit about helping countries make decisions about identifying whether areas are degraded or not. Think a little bit about the prediction of degradation, and then think about some confidence metrics. I think these are things that we could really use support in from the GEO community, in addition to just getting involved with the GEO LDN initiative. We need more people coming on board. Also, don't forget to ask questions. A lot of this thinking that I'm going to talk to you about now is quite new, let's say, and I might stumble a little bit. Some of your questions could be interesting and useful for me. So what we found when we wrote the Good Practice Guidance document was that we kind of went, we'd envisaged a few scenarios of land change, land cover and land use change in our minds. And there were a couple that we kind of didn't really think about. In the recent round of LDN reporting and SDG 15.3.1 reporting, some of the countries were reporting situations to us we hadn't thought of. And a couple of them are these. So, for example, and the one that people talked about as we were writing the Good Practice Guidance document was this one. They say, well, so if you've got your primary productivity at a certain level, and then you've got an area that gets invaded by a woody species or some other one, that increases the productivity, which means no degradation, but it's actually a bad outcome. Right? It's an undesirable outcome, possibly, for that land area. So how does the Good Practice Guidance document and the methods deal with this? Well, it says if your productivity is going up, but your land cover type changes to something that you prefer less, then we have a system called one out, all out. So if one of the indicators shows degradation, any one of them, then that pixel is labelled as degraded. So it's kind of a precautionary principle. So this kind of thing is pretty straightforward to me, right? Countries have always had the ability to make their own choices about how they label an area as degraded. And this is just reminding them that they've got this possibility. The trickier one is actually where they go to restore the land. So we've got this area that's got woody vegetation all over it. The first thing you do is you clear the land, and of course that reduces your primary productivity, which triggers degradation in the one out, all out process. And yet that's something that's a restoration goal. That's a restorative action. So how do you deal with that kind of thing? I hadn't envisaged that kind of thing. Remarkably, it seems obvious now, but anyway. And there's changes in primary productivity, and soil organic carbon are the two that the countries are really reporting that need a bit more thought. And so, what countries have always had the right to label any part degraded or not, but at the same time, I can understand a country turning like a forest into agriculture or something like that, and that being a development goal for them. That's something they desperately need, and so countries have the right to label that as degraded or not. Of course, we don't want countries going, we really needed a car park in this area, and so we've converted this forest to car park, and we're not going to label that as degraded. That would be inconsistent with the vision for LDN, and so we're sort of working on developing a framework to help countries go through a process of identifying whether they should be labelling an area as degraded or not. And this will lead us to some of the data sets that I think we need a bit later on from you. So if you're identify an area where you think that the method, the one out, all out method, is giving you a perverse outcome, well then in the framework document for land degradation neutrality, it says the first thing you should do, actually before you do anything, is have a look at the drivers and pressures on different parts of the land. And so once you understand the drivers and pressures, then we've come up with this kind of a matrix. I'd like your feedback on this, actually. A bit of a matrix to help guide some decisions for countries. And then you go back to your, drivers, pressures, state, impacts and response network, and then you try and plan your responses about whether you need to look at the drivers and pressures and there's something you can do to influence that, or whether you go to the state and you say, hey, we've actually got to restore the land now to a better condition. So here's the drivers, pressures, state, impacts, response network, and if we have a look again, this is from the framework document. Basically, what they really want countries to do is to avoid or reduce degradation. And That comes down to a couple of things. First, you need to get a control on the drivers and the pressures of the degradation. That'll reduce and prevent degradation. But also, it's a great idea to be able to predict areas that are going to be degraded as well. And some of that analytics, I think, is where we need to head, and that means some new data sets might be required. And of course, then there's the option to reverse it, which is the most expensive and labour-intensive option, but maybe we're at a state in some parts of the world now where we do need restorative action rather than just prevention. So there was that, and so we have this is the matrix. So we've got our countries thinking about the drivers and pressures, thinking about what they can do to prevent degradation, but they've still got this condition, this state where something has happened and they're getting an answer from the good practice guidance methods that is inconsistent with their ambitions, like I said, if they're restoring an area and yet it leads it to be labelled as degradation. And so this is essentially a guide for countries to think about the kinds of options that they have available to them when they're reviewing their degradation needs. So here we go. Let's see if I get this right. Ask questions. So we have essentially, it comes down to whether a transition in the condition of a land is desirable or undesirable. That's basically what you want, right? And then we have the sub-indicator change. In this case, we're looking at soil organic carbon. There's a couple of really interesting problems, if you like, with soil organic carbon. One is it changes incredibly slowly, and so it's actually really hard to measure. But the other thing is it responds in a way that can be not synchronised to other changes in the landscape. So if we have our invasion of woody weeds and we clear the woody weeds, so the woody weeds may increase soil organic carbon above what was there before. We clear the woody weeds, but the soil organic carbon remains high. We've had reports of countries saying actually the soil organic carbon remained higher than was, so it prevented the previous vegetation recolonising the area because the soil organic carbon was too high. So it's this really dislocated thing, hard to measure and tricky. So, for example, we can have an increase in our soil organic carbon that might be undesirable from alien invasive species and woody encroachment, and land abandonment is another mechanism there as well, areas that have been cleared from forestry, used for agriculture and have been abandoned. That can leave the soil organic carbon higher than we like. We might have an increase in soil organic carbon that's positive though, right? So regenerative agriculture and habitat restoration, things like that. We can have a decrease in soil organic carbon that's undesirable, which is kind of, the typical logic, if you like, of typically you want to improve your soil organic carbon concentration from land clearing and overgrazing and things like this. But we can also have a decrease that's desirable if we're restoring an area, its soil organic carbon levels back to the state where the native vegetation is happy to recolonise. And so this basically just presents to countries the thinking that they have the opportunity to go through to identify areas as degraded or not. What we're trying to do, remember here, is provide a framework that globally provides that kind of consistency so that we're not getting one country calling a car park not degraded and another country calling it degraded. And so once you determined whether your cause and effect is desirable or undesirable, then you go back here again to your DPSIR framework and you have a look at how you can respond, some of the response opportunities for you. So again, you can, in terms of responses, you can reduce or control or influence the pressures on the land, or you can restore or reverse the degradation. Again, this is preferable, it's cheaper and more effective. And here we go. We've got, if we're trying to hit these marks here of avoid and reduce, we really want to be able to predict where degradation is likely to occur or identify areas that are at risk. Questions, anyone? No? Good. Right. So in terms of prediction, what this relies on really is connecting a range of data sources that have been hard to connect, in part because of their different formats, but also in part because of the different availability and largely because of political reasons. You know, some institutions just don't talk to other institutions very well. I don't know whether it's better, for example, in a communist country than it is in Australia. I'm unsure. It might be. But we're struggling to get these data sets connected in the kinds of way at national scales that I think could really benefit a lot of countries. So I'll just talk quickly through this. So this is a bit, what is this, a land use, September 2018. And I just dragged these straight off the web like yesterday. This is how much preparation we've done for this particular talk. And you know, we've got climate change models, for example. We've got our existing land use, climate change models. We've got our map of degradation here. And then what you might be able to do is combine land use planning information with climate predictions and some environmental information to predict areas that are likely vulnerable to particular types of changes. So in this case, this is something that came out quite a few years ago from the USDA on desertification vulnerability. That's the kind of thing where we can really help countries by facilitating the connection of the data sets and providing a couple of new data sets for them to work on. Confidence metrics are another thing, and you know, man, science is a funny game these days, right? And I can do my best to produce the best information possible, and someone can legitimately pick a hole in it somewhere, right? There's always a gap somewhere. And so we have to try and provide information to end users about how confident we are in the data sets. And there are some fantastic, very thorough, but complex ways to do that, and there are some quite simple ones. So, for example, we know about NDVI and EVI, right? So many of these different data sets give you different information, even though they're really similar. So this is just looking at you know, change in an area in the United States, I think it is, you know, between NDVI and EVI. And there's a lot of colours in there, right? We're showing some differences. These are all many different models, I think, of rainfall variability. I think, is that right? Across Australia. There are great ways to validate the things like you know, primary productivity and soil organic carbon numbers. They are pretty labour intensive, right? It's pretty expensive to get out there with this kit. It takes a long time with your scissors cutting the grass and stuff, and I've done that in the past. This is an example here where we've used, if you come, I think I might be presenting this in one of the Pacific sessions, but I found these really old maps of mangroves in Fiji, and I digitised them and registered them over Google Earth imagery, and the patterns from there, and the maps are about 1978, something like that, data. And the patterns you can see in the mangroves and you can see in the old data actually match pretty well. And so we've run a sort of a random forest classification between the Google Earth, using Google Earth essentially to train our training sites and Sentinel data. And we come up with a map that, based on really old data, that shows us the new distribution of mangroves in Fiji. And it was pretty cheap. In fact, I got virtual slaves to do this. I had a high school student, work experience, she was brilliant, and a guy came over from Canada who wanted to work at CSIRO. So this has gone really, really well. I'm looking for more students if anyone has a student to complete the work, so let me know afterwards. Okay, and of course then the Collect Earth system is another really good sort of low-cost way to validate the numbers. To get some confidence information. Here's a really simple example maybe that might just work okay for certain people. So what these are models of land degradation, 4 different models of land degradation, and you can see it's really, they're giving us quite different numbers there, right? Quite different proportions and different distributions of land degradation. And this is from a paper by Gibbs and Salmon in 2015. And so what Gibbs and Salmon did was basically they looked at where the data sets were in agreement. They took those 4 methods and, you know, I don't know which one's the best. And of course, land degradation is this really contentious issue, and the definition of it drives people mad. You know, people spend ages complaining about the UNCCD definition or complaining about another one or proposing another one. And there's really genuinely good reasons. People have got great intentions with all of this. But here's a really simple way to basically have a look at, well, you've got 4 different models, where do they concord? And it seems to be in China here, I think, that we're getting some of the least concordance, and that most of the rest of the world seems pretty good. I don't know, there's 2 or 3 every now and again. This one shows the percentage, the concordance in the percentage of the area degraded. And this shows us a little bit of a different pattern there as well. So this kind of information could basically be used, if somebody says, hey, your model's no good, my model's better, well, they're trying to show the same thing. Let's get them together and just do simple things to have a look at how they overlay and their concordance between them. So those kind of data sets might be really useful. This is what I think is the bigger challenge for this community, something that GEO can really tackle where few other organisations can, is the problem, in fact, that all these arrows you can see sort of pointing to Europe. What this is basically land resources displaced to support foreign consumption. And so, for example, and I think the example that's used in the paper is, someone in Rome wants a spoon. Cool. Well, that comes from 2 cubic metres of soil in Australia, probably. And so the point here, and I presented this at the Belt and Road Initiative actually, we're all interconnected, much more deeply interconnected than we have been ever before. Our degradation, the drivers and the pressures of the degradation are coming from other countries, perhaps, other parts of the globe. And so we really need to be thinking about the exchanges of the information right across the globe, right throughout these trade networks. That means the Sustainable Development Goal process, of course, focuses very strongly on national data. So each country is, strongly encouraged to make their own national data sets and even to, come up with new and interesting ways. They don't have to use trends.earth. They can combine it in many other ways. But, the degradation you're reporting in your country might be driven by some other country. And so I don't think the national level is actually good enough anymore. I don't think it's big enough anymore. I think we need to think about degradation right through these trade networks. I think that's the last slide. Is that the last slide?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's my slide.
Okay, cool. And so just to wrap up there, the kinds of data sets that we need then, if you think about the matrix that we talked about, and really things are desirable or they're undesirable. So the kinds of data that we've got at the moment that we can use for this are, we've got land use information, which is good in some areas and not very good in others. We've got, land cover type information, we've got productivity information. We haven't got a good carbon map. There doesn't exist. It doesn't exist at this time. I've seen maps that have combined above ground and below ground carbon, which is actually the sub-indicator, carbon stocks above and below ground, but that hasn't quite happened the way, it's just a joining of maps essentially is what it was, rather than an overall assessment method. So that a total carbon stock method is really vitally important. And I think the part of the information that we're missing for land use is kind of about really the intention for the land use. And perhaps maybe there's a way to think about, is it for human consumption? Is it for stock feed? This kind of detail, this additional level of detail is really needed in many countries, I think, to really identify whether that transition that you've seen is desirable or undesirable. And that information is difficult to get, even in Australia, which really is one of the most advanced countries in the world for this kind of thing. You can't quite get down to that level of granularity, at least not very easily. So this kind of information would be a fantastic benefit, I think, to examining land degradation neutrality in the context of sustainable development and in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Right, thank you.
Great, thank you, Neil. Before I get to that slide, I just want to, this may be confidential, but I'm going to say it anyways. And you can see from the passion of my two colleagues here and the amount of work that they've done that they really deserve these awards. So this is going to be at the dinner ceremony on Thursday, or Wednesday or Thursday. But CSIRO for the Good Practice Guidance document, and Conservation International in terms of making that access, democratizing access to all this important information and making it policy relevant. So we're really fortunate to work with you guys. Thank you so much. I also want to thank the Secretariat who has been supporting this initiative. I know that they're not required to do so. I know a lot of initiatives go on and have a secretariat on their own and stuff, but Doug has been super supportive of us and used, of course, for the capacity building. So I'm really thankful. Our parties are very thankful for that. But we really want to hear from you guys. And then last but not least are our co-chairs. Of course, two of not here. Antje from GIZ, the German development agency, been super active in this process, and Amos from Ghana, representing the civil society and the academic community. So I'm really appreciative to their contributions as well. Okay, so we have some questions. We have some needs, some desires to see if we could get a little bit of information from you all. First of all, can I just ask a show of hands, how many, if I were to break it up in terms of data providers and data users, and then maybe there's a value chain in the middle there, who's on the data provider end of things? Can anybody, would you raise your hands in terms of, are there a couple of data providers here? Okay, so there's a few. Data users, strictly, yeah? Okay, and then in the middle, the value, sustainable value chains that go through that? Okay, all right. Countries? Any countries here? Any member states? Okay. Okay, two. And POs? No POs. Wow. Okay. So that gives us a lay of the land. So these are some of the things that we want to talk to you about and see how we... GEO-regional initiatives. Anybody here from any of the GEO-regional initiatives? No. Okay. Great. So first question, please. Is this mic on? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to walk around. Those guys will anchor it for us.
So how do you unscramble the natural progression and cyclical changes in vegetation, the state, from degradation? What was is not necessarily the natural state of the vegetation as it would be today. Think of ice ages that have come, species have migrated up and down naturally. So with climate change, we've got different CO2 concentrations, and the response of vegetation will be different from what it was 50 years ago.
Yep.
Yeah, and we could probably talk about this for 2-3 hours, if not days.
We've got an hour.
but I think, I'm sure Neil will have thoughts too, but I think there's different approaches depending, of course, on what the aims are in terms of reporting to UNCCD, Essentially, the agreement has, and Sasha, correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, but essentially the idea is to report degradation while not correcting for those climate factors, in part because, of course, degradation, if there's an indication of degradation on the ground, that's important to parties in any case, regardless of whether the driver is climate or not. So in terms of UNCCD reporting, that's the tack that's taken. In terms of the tools that are out there, though, of course, there are measures and approaches to try and remove or account for those climate effects so that you can get a better idea whether it's actually anthropogenic or whether it's something that's more cyclable or longer term climate change. So there are various approaches you can use to do that, ResTrend and others, using whether it's water use efficiency or other measures of impacts of precipitation. Those are implemented in tools so that they are available for users to use. However, they're just not used by default in the reporting. I don't know if you want to add.
If you're not accounting for these natural changes, then everything is degraded. Because nothing will go back to its original state. That's no longer dynamic.
Well, that's also not what degradation is, though. Change is a move towards essentially an undesirable state. And some of these changes, you know, there's the greening effect of carbon dioxide and things like that. When we wrote the good practice guidance document, part of the process was to, you know, get a big group of, you know, global experts together and review the document. Every one of the sub-indicators had its own challenges, right? So soil organic carbon, as I said before, was it's slow, it's hard to measure, and the people who love the soils are evangelical that soil organic carbon is the key factor, right? So that's okay. The land cover one is tricky because it's hard to do a robust. There isn't a good way to determine land cover degradation across a time series of observations of land cover, because land cover tends to change in areas sort of throughout time. And in some cases it might be what you call a degradation, in other cases it might be what you call an improvement if land gets abandoned for things like, for example. So it's the difficulty with that one. With productivity, man, everyone has got their own way to do it, and everyone's got a really strong, and the community of land productivity people was divided about 50-50, and I led the writing of the land productivity part, which is good and bad, divided about 50-50 between people who said you must absolutely calibrate climate impacts out of your time series. You know, climate variation is one thing, but what we really want to see is the impact of interventions and things more clearly on the productivity. And there was another, about 50% said you must absolutely not calibrate out climate variations, because any reduction in NPP is a reduction in NPP, and if that's what degradation is, then that's the way you've got to report it. In the document, in the good practice guidance document, and this is why we provide the options really in trends.earth, is because I think both parts of information are really useful. You know, you want to know how your climate is impacting your productivity, but you also want to be able to untangle the anthropogenic side as well as you can from those cycles too. I think they provide you actually different perspectives on productivity degradation, and both are important and both should be considered when you're assessing your final sort of impact, your indicator level, I think. But this issue, man, was the problem with the productivity one, the definitive passion differences between the experts was the challenge with this one.
Great. So another question here, up there.
My name is Stefan Fritz. I'm from IASA. Thanks for these very interesting insights you've given us. Just one comment and one question. So one comment is, I think one reason also why the land cover part is quite difficult is because until now we don't really have any reliable land cover change data set. There's something on forest which is reasonably reliable, as we know, but I think on the land cover side we really have currently very high uncertainties if we really look at time series currently available. So there's a lot of work still to be done on that. The question is on the desirability. Did you have any disagreement on what is desirable and what is not, because I could imagine that, you know, people coming from different disciplines having different interests and defining the word desirable very, very differently. Yeah. This could be even on the species and on the invasive side, because some invasives, you know, there is a difference between invasives. So in some invasives, they might be resistant to future climate change. For example, you might not want to remove them, whereas also on the other hand, in terms of restoration, you know, you could argue that oil palm is some type of restoration if you restore some burned area or something. So do you have anything to say on that desirability, on your feedback you got from people?
Well, you know, you are the first feedback on the desirability matrix, so thank you very much. It's really new, and I've been working with a couple of the people in the UNCCD. It's essentially a response to the comments on the Good Practice Guidance document and 15.3.1 from the latest reporting round. So I guess the desirability is ultimately by the top of the tree in the reporting chain per country, whether they think something's desirable or not is ultimately, I guess, how they work. But that's a great point. With your question about the land cover data sets, you're right. I think the CCILC is the data set that we've recommended for use, because I think it's the best. It's a good time series. The other problem, though, is really about the analytics. So if I have, what we find is any given region tends to change. Regions that exhibit a change tend to show more than one change over, say, a 15-year period. And so if we have a time series that is 16 years long, which is the baseline period, and we've got 12 years of forest, and then concrete, right? So how do you interpret that change? In the baseline period, for example, some suggestions, and in the LDN framework it says take an average of the land cover type over the 16 years. So even though it's now appearing as concrete, on average we'd still call it forest. And then what you find is as well is that you get maybe years of forest, a few years of agriculture, and then back to forest again for, say, the last year of your observation. So one recommendation or one option for interpreting that time series is to say any region that throughout its entire time series has exhibited any change from a preferred state to a less preferred one should be labelled as degradation, even though at the end we're back to native vegetation again. So it's a time series problem, and I don't think it can be done analytically. I think it has to be done subjectively. It's a really tricky one. I don't know the best method actually.
Yeah. So
I don't know what they do with Trends.earth.
Right. The change matrix in the tools in the Trends.earth.
Yeah, and so in terms of the way that we implement this in the Trends.earth tool, so there's flexibility in the way that the transitions are defined, because of course it's not something that's objective. Of course there's subjectivity in terms of whether a particular transition, whether it's woody encroachment or not, etc. So there is the flexibility in the tool for countries to modify that matrix. There's a default matrix that was discussed by the UNCCD and agreed to by parties that can be modified though within the tool. But of course then there's other challenges beyond that. We did a fair amount of work in South Africa. I know there, of course, they were saying, well, but we can't agree to a transition matrix at the national level. This is something that perhaps needs to vary by biome or regionally. So I think there's certainly more flexibility that's needed there. Another challenge also is in the point about quality of land cover data sets is an important one. I think it's even more challenging when you're working with nationally produced land cover data sets, because in many cases those may not be consistent temporally in the way that they're derived. There can be, of course, higher area for combining data sets. So that's something that we're looking at right now. I think there's starting to be better tools to enable production of those national level data sets. For example, of course, Collect Earth is one, but we still need a lot of work on, I think, on the data standards and data quality side to provide better guidance on what the characteristics are of a land cover data set at the national scale.
Okay. Yeah.
Firstly, thanks for the wonderful presentation. My name is Xiaosong Li from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I have three questions, but each question is brief. Firstly, I heard from the presentation the SDG 15.3 this year, the indicator has upgraded to the tier 1. The indicator is true?
Yes.
To my knowledge, the tier 1 indicator should be the concept clearly and the clearly data set and the measures. But from the GPG, also we can see there's a lot of the uncertainties about the data sets, the methodology. And also I know a lot of people now working on how to contribute to upgrade to the tier 2 to the tier 1. So I want to know, can you explain about this? What's the key stone for upgrade this indicator to tier 2 to tier 1?
Yes, so this is a process in the statistical community. So these are statisticians that are running this SDG indicator framework, okay? They have make the determination based on our presentation, our capacity building, our reporting process, that the standards and the methodology is conceptually clear. Yes, there can be uncertainty, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's no clarity, okay? There's always room for improvement. Many of the indicators, if you look at the 240 indicators, many of them have a lot of uncertainty. So if we were to operate on that premise, we would have very few tier 1 indicators. So in the interest of moving forward in terms of monitoring the SDGs, the statistical community makes that determination. So that's why they've come to the tier 1 status. Okay? Okay.
But that doesn't mean that it's fixed, right? It's not static and fixed then. It's still an evolving process because data sets and conditions change all the time.
Sure. Another question is some technical questions. It's we can see that for the 3 sub-indicators currently, both the data set have a different the confidence, I think. Maybe we can get the high quality of the land cover data compared to the other data sets, especially the soil and carbon data you mentioned. But in the GPD, we can see the standard is 1 out, all out. How about to give the different weights to the different sub-indicators?
Yeah, I was talking about this possibility. So the question was, the 1 out, all out process is pretty brutal, and especially if you've got data sets with different sensitivity levels in there. So can you sort of weight them? I think that is a possibility for inclusion in the next version of the Good Practice Guidance document, I think. But we would need to provide some guidance so that it's done consistently. And my appeal to the people in here who, can provide the data sets was have a think about reporting the accuracy and sensitivity of the data sets that you're producing in ways that are easily digestible by people who are making decisions on that data. Yes, that's a fair point. 1 out, all out is pretty brutal, but we used a precautionary principle really in the SDGs, and so it does tend to err, if you like, towards identifying a larger area of degradation. But I think that is more appropriate, provided it's done consistently, than underestimating. And so, yes, it's not a bad point. Anyway, did you have one? Did it?
Next question. I think there was another question up here. No? Yeah.
So degradation is something that affects the third world more than the first world in many ways, to some extent at least. But assessing what is degradation is difficult. Shouldn't you argument or argue the indicators they use to determine what degradation is, what not degradation is, by the instrumental value theories that are available? So you've got intrinsic value theories, which says that any object has a right, or a state has a right to exist as it is, or instrumental value theories that are, well, it's good for humankind in the long term, sustainably, to be in this state or to develop in that direction. So if you would argue it according to the sustainable use to humans in the long term, that would be a nice measure of degradation.
I'm not familiar with those frameworks, actually. Maybe, I'll give you a card later on. What I would also say, just really on that, is that, we're hearing a lot of information about the state of the planet these days, and perhaps not all of it is true. But at the same time, all of that has happened in the context of sustainable development, pretty much, right? We've done most of the damage, I think, to the ecosystems on the planet since about 1970, I think, since bulldozers got really good, and that's also been the time of sustainable development, so there's perspectives on sustainability, I think, are a really interesting thing to think about in that context as well. But I'm not familiar with those frameworks.
Any other more technical questions? If not, then I hope we've provided you with an overview, and we've exposed ourselves as a very nascent initiative. We're 1 year old. I want to hear more generally. Could anybody tell us how you think we could be more successful as a GEO initiative? Does anybody have any ideas or have any experiences that they could share with us?
Does anyone have tons of cash that they need to get rid of?
No, we're not, yeah.
No?
Okay. So you're all just here to learn. Yes, please, up top.
Thanks. I don't have tons of cash, but one idea I've got is that, at the moment a lot of this seems to be very focused around using the Earth observations data, but there's a whole lot of other administrative data out there, particularly in understanding land uses and what's possible on certain bits of land. But at the moment we don't have very good systems to integrate that, and particularly in Australia, the information about who owns the land, who owns which land, what they can do with it, what it's worth, is tied up in a whole lot of separate data sets, not a single national data set. Yeah. And that's essentially what you need to start integrating all these administrative data sets that, generally they're spatial indicators and address, which is one point, but it doesn't tell you about the broader spread of where that information's happening. And I wonder if there's other countries where they have better information about who owns the land and what's possible on it, where there's better integration between that administrative and the Earth observation data.
No, there's quite a deficit in terms of that information, and Australia is probably leading in terms of being able to provide that. What would be the modalities for integrating, because we always talk about bringing the socioeconomic data and layering that with that, and then it comes down to, okay, do we need a data cube, or what's the modality for doing that, and then can we reasonably do that for all our parties and have them assume ownership, be comfortable with it? It took us so much capacity building to make them comfortable with this process with 3 indicators. So if you're going to start talking about sensitive indicators, it's daunting, the task. But Neil.
Australia really is one of the most advanced countries in the world on this, and and you forget it when you're working and living in Australia, right? Until you go somewhere else and you go, man, it's like, you know, we've done so well here in this country. But you're right, it's the challenge, there's two challenges really, the technical one and a lot of the sort of data cube infrastructures are working on that very thing now, how to incorporate lots of different types of data set into a one sort of stackable pile, if you like. But the bigger problem, and probably the less surmountable one, is the politics between the institutions. And, you know, and in Australia, again, I think we probably have that pretty well sorted. Like, you know, and I mentioned earlier whether it might be easier, you know, in a communist country to go, actually, we want this data in this system now. You know, so we're working with Vietnam, for example, where we're trying to predict land degradation there, and it might be that we're more able to access that kind of different information.
Yeah, and I think, and just to add, so of course that information is key and certainly, of course, is not broadly accessible. We were just having a meeting last week. We have a new project starting out to do some further work around Trends.Earth WOCAT, which is the world overview of conservation approaches and technologies, and also Land PKS, the Land Potential Knowledge System. And we were having a lot of discussion there about how we might integrate collection of that information into mobile data collection tools. And so it's something we're looking at, but again, of course, it does raise a lot of political considerations once you start adding collection of that type of information, but it's a key need. So I think we need to work through that and figure out a way that we can start gathering that information more broadly.
Can I just, so has this piqued anyone's interest in terms of, do you now, after the last hour and a half, feel more inclined to come and, you know, talk with one of us about the LDN program? I mean, is it something that's of interest to people more than it was, say, an hour and a half ago? Anyone? That's disappointing.
Since I have the microphone, I have to talk now about your question.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was always interested, so I was following it. I didn't yet have the time, but I think it's a very important critical initiative for sure. I just wanted to make one suggestion on maybe where some improvements could happen, but I know it's, of course, always challenging to dig down into the countries and to work more closely with the countries. But we have one project, it's called Restore Plus. It's a project funded by the German Climate Fund. And we are focusing on two countries, Brazil and Indonesia. And in Indonesia, we are really looking at this more detailed, of course, national data sets. Maybe we can try to also find some linkages there. But one thing we are also doing is we look at the acceptability of proposed restoration within the population. So we are using some crowdsourcing tools, some apps we've been developing to ask people, essentially some spatial kind of questionnaire on what type of restoration would be most accepted by the population at this particular place, of course taking all the other constraints into account on how the country wants certain development plans and so forth. So this might be something where we could also link up, so maybe we can talk afterwards.
Yep,
thanks.
That'd be good. You might be interested in that one, I think, yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Joost Deuben. I work for the GEO Secretariat, supporting the working group number 1. I have no suggestion, only a request. We have the working group, we have a co-chair from Africa, we have 3 co-leads from Africa, and we have members from the African continent. So my request is, if there are other people from the other continents, Asia and Latin America, willing to contribute to the first working group on capacity development. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joost.
Yeah, now is a great time to engage with this, actually, because we really are a new initiative. The interesting and the unique thing about this initiative is that, you know, Sasha decided to appeal to GEO in Washington a couple of sessions ago, and basically ask GEO for help, you know, on this sustainable development goal, and that started this whole initiative. That model hasn't happened before, and so it's you know, we're learning how to do this, and it's young enough that if you were really interested in contributing, you can really do a lot to shape the future and the success of this organisation. So now it really is a great time to talk to us. Yes, hello.
Hi, I'm Bob Chen. I co-chair the Human Planet Initiative along with JRC, with some of you know Danielle Ehrlich here. I just wanted to put in a plug that, you know, in terms of a GEO group that's looking at these social and human issues, we're working on it. It's early stages, but we are looking at issues like urbanization, future population distribution, movement of people that are one of the factors affecting degradation. And there are groups out there generating data and increasingly sophisticated models that, you know, at some point need to be interfaced, I think, with what you guys are doing.
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Good. Any other comments, questions, suggestions, advice, guidance? Okay. Well, we'll be here all week.
Yep.
So if you grab us, want to talk to us on a one-on-one basis, that'd be fine. And thank you all for coming. On behalf of my two colleagues here, we really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.